Okay, everyone, welcome to our next presentation as part of the virtual Poudre River Fest. We have Flowing for the Future, presented by the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. All of our Lunch and Learn sessions during the virtual Poudre River Fest are brought to you by Mountain Avenue Market. And just a few Zoom call etiquette. All participants will be muted and you will not be able to unmute yourself. If you're interested, you're more than happy to turn your camera on, but we do ask that if you have any background distraction that you do keep your camera off. And you will be able to ask questions through the chat feature. If you are watching on Facebook, you can also ask questions through the comments, and I can try to get those asked within the Zoom call. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Haley, and you can get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hallie Streevy, and I'm the Program Manager for the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. We're a local 501c3 nonprofit that's based in Fort Collins. The Coalition's mission is to improve and maintain the ecological health of the Poudre River watershed through community collaboration. We're also one of the organizing committee members for the Poudre River Fest. In today's webinar, we have some great panelists to speak to you about the research behind fish passage on ditch diversion structures and how it can benefit native fish. We will also present a case study to discuss the process of designing and implementing fish passage and diversion restoration project on the South Platte River, including the experience and perspective of the Ditch Company. I'd like to introduce you all now to our panelists. We have Dr. Chris Myrick, who is a professor of fish ecology in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at Colorado State University. Tracy Emanuel, a fluvial geomorphologist with OTAC, and Daniel Gallen, who is the treasurer with the Godfrey Ditch Company. And then if you do have questions, please use the chat box, and we will answer them as we have time at the end. And with that, I will turn it on over to Dr. Myrick.
All right, let me go ahead and start sharing here. And fire this up. Okay, so thank you all for attending this lunch webinar, and thank you for the invitation to give a quick presentation on front range fish passage design and monitoring. As they said, I'm a professor at Colorado State University. I've been there about 20 years, and my primary area of research is on fish passage and fish barrier design and monitoring. And we've done a fair bit of work in the Poudre River Basin as well as up and down the Front Range. So I'll just launch into the presentation, and definitely if you have questions, go ahead and type those into the chat box, because I do really enjoy answering questions about fish and fish passage. And really, while I guess you could say I take the credit for this work, it really is the work of my graduate students and an absolute army of undergraduates. They're the ones who put in the longest hours, the hardest hours, and I normally sit in my office and occasionally go visit the research projects and go, oh, it's looking good, good job, keep it up. So it's really their work, and it really wouldn't happen without the support of our various funding sources and our collaborators, because this is definitely not work that's done in a vacuum. It's not something that the university can do by itself. It really only happens because we collaborate with various agencies and other entities. So again, even though I take credit for this, it's really my grad students and the undergrads who deserve all of the credit for what you're about to see. Okay, so when I got to CSU 20 odd years ago, I was not a fish passage specialist. I had done some fish swimming, I had done work in aquaculture, some limiting factors research, some fisheries engineering, and really a lot of physiology for salmon and trout. But when you start off as a new professor, what really matters is what can you get funded, and what is novel, and what can you publish. So my first graduate student, Matt Kondratiev, and I came up with what we thought was then kind of a wild and risky idea to try to measure fish jumping ability and fish passage techniques. And by doing so, we started down this pathway of first figuring out how fast fish could jump, then trying to figure out how high they could jump, and then figuring out how fast they could swim. We then turned that from a barrier standpoint into more of a passage standpoint. And it has since just snowballed into almost an all-consuming research area for the whole lab. where we've done some theoretical work, we've done some field work, and we also do a fair bit of lab work trying to come up with better ways to restore connectivity to front range rivers like the Poudre River and allow for fish passage. Now, I will admit, as a California transplant, that when I got to Colorado, my view of Colorado was trout. You know, fish up in the mountains, things like this cutthroat trout or a brown trout or rainbow trout or brook trout. And it was really only after I got here, and actually when I landed for my interview and realized as I was driving to Fort Collins that, hey, there's a lot of flat land out here, it's not all mountains, that I came to the realization that we actually have a lot of plains fish. In fact, we have more species of fish living out on the eastern plains than we do have living in the mountains. And these are things like shiners and darters and sunfish and suckers, which a lot of people don't think about. These are really, really neat fish. And in fact, everybody works on trout and salmon. And don't get me wrong, they're really cool. Nobody works on the little fish. And that to me was even more exciting because someone's got to speak for the little fish. Someone has to work with the little fish. And they just do some really neat things. So if you look at some of these Great Plains fishes, you'll see one, that they're really diverse. Just in the South Platte River Basin within Colorado alone, we have actually more than 29 species now. They tend to be fairly small. A big Great Plains fish is only about 6 inches long. Many of them are only 3 or 4 inches long as adults. And they have variable lifespans. Some only live for a couple years. Some of them we've discovered actually live for more than a decade, even though they're very small fish. Now they're adapted to these low gradient systems that don't have a lot of vertical obstacles. And because of that, they're used to making these long distance migrations. And they can actually recolonize areas if they become locally extinct, provided they can still migrate back to that area, either from upstream or from downstream. Now, from a fish passage standpoint, what's really interesting is that even though these fish are really good swimmers, typically, they don't jump when they encounter obstacles. And that's very different from the salmon and trout that I was most accustomed to from my work out in California. So why is this an issue? Well, we put diversions everywhere. And we do so for good reasons. We have a lot of diversions for agricultural uses. We have diversions for flood control, or in-stream obstacles rather, for flood control. And if you're just to look at the Poudre River, between the mouth of the Poudre River Canyon up here, and then down here you've got the I-25 bridge, there are 13 diversions in a stretch that's a little over 17 miles long. And only 3 of those diversions actually have fish passage structures. The others are probably partial or complete barriers to fish passage. And it was seeing this sort of this preponderance of these in-stream structures and realizing that they could potentially be chopping the Poudre River, or really any of our front range streams or rivers, into these smaller segments and interrupting that connectivity. That sort of drove the research that my lab's been doing for the last 20 years. And if you were to walk along the Poudre River, or you were to walk along even Spring Creek here in Fort Collins, you would see that most of these diversions, most of these grade control structures are some sort of vertical drop, and they tend to be barriers to most of the fish, because again, remember, these fish are small, and they don't generally jump over obstacles, with the exception of the trout and the various sucker species that we have, which are bigger and will actually jump if they encounter an obstacle. Now, we did an early study where we actually tried to measure the jumping ability of some of these small fish. And in addition to discovering that most of them just don't jump, the few that do jump are really small. They might only be 4 inches long, 5 inches long. They might be able to jump 2 or 3 times their body length. But if you've got an obstacle that's 1.5 feet high, that is essentially impassable. They can't jump over that type of obstacle. So really it comes down to, well, what does work if you want to build a fish ladder or fish passage structure to get these fish up past these obstacles? And that was sort of the driving force behind our research projects, or our ongoing research projects, is trying to figure out what type of fish passage structures work best for these front range fish. Now, can we use the various fishways that have been designed for salmon or trout, or do we need to go with something different? We wanted to figure out how we can fine tune existing fish passage designs for our front range species, given that they're not salmon, given that they're mostly not trout, what is the ideal slope or gradient for those structures? How long can they be before you have a resting area? What type of substrate and what type of substrate texture do you need? And then probably the most important questions, based on what we can learn in the lab, is, well, if we can build one of these in the lab and get it to work, what happens when you put it in the field? So how well do existing structures actually function in the field? Because we have started to see these fish passage structures or fishways getting installed in various parts of the Front Range. So that's essentially what we've been looking at for the last 20 years. And I'll start off with one of the lab studies, and this is one where we're just trying to come up with the design criteria. So these would be the numbers we would give to engineers who are building a fishway or fish passage structure. And they say, well, how long does it need to be? How steep does it need to be? How fast does the water need to go? How many resting areas do you need? And the best way we've come up with to test this is to use this 30-foot flume that we built at my lab at Colorado State, which we can raise the entire flume from a slope of 0 to 10%. We can pump about 3 cubic feet per second of water down it. And then we have a series of pit tag or RFID antennas in the flume so we can track fish movements as they move up and down the flume. Now by using this flume, and you can see a picture of it here on this side of the screen, by using this flume and looking at different slopes, looking at different placement of the substrate inside of the flume, different substrate textures, we were able to come up with some recommendations for allowing fish passage of these small plains fish. So I'll just show you a couple sets of results. Start off with a flathead chub. This is a kind of a handsome little critter here. It's the flathead chub up there. And if you look at these results here, what you'll see is the slope here. So 10, 8, 6, 4, and 2%. A1, A2, A3, and A4 correspond to the actual antennas. So they're going past antenna 1, 2, 3, 4 as they go upstream. And then the numbers inside of the box, the 1 in this case, and then 0 here, or 0.96 here, is the probability that a fish could make it to that antenna. And then this little scale on the bottom just shows you how far the fish have gone when they get to antenna 2 or they get to antenna 3, or if they make it all the way up to antenna 4 at 20 feet. Now flathead chub are really good swimmers. So even at a 10% slope, they are able to sprint up 6 feet of that 10% slope and get to antenna 2, but none of them could make it up to antenna 3. By the time you come down to an 8% slope, most of them are getting up past antenna 3, and then at a 6% slope, they can all make it. So if you were looking at this, you'd be like, hey, looks like we can get away with a 6% slope if we have flathead chub in our stream, because they are such good swimmers. And anything less than 6%, my students and I would say they could actually go up sideways or backwards because they are such amazing swimmers. So they can use these fishways that don't have a lot of resting areas because they have that good swimming ability. But designing your fishway for the best swimming fish in the system is probably not a good idea. And that is why we looked at what darters could do. Now darters are a very small fish. A big darter is about 4 inches long. They're not very good swimmers. They can sprint short distances, but their stamina is really poor. And when we started looking at darters, and again, the same sort of result slides here, what you see is that at an 8% slope, they get over antenna 1, and very few, or they have a very low probability of getting to antenna 2. Even at a 6% slope, they have a very low probability of getting to that second antenna. And it's only at a 4% slope that you start getting a decent probability of them going even 6 feet up that rock ramp fishway. And they do better still if you drop it down to a 2% slope. Now, if you're an engineer and you're trying to install one of these fishways and you're looking at a 2% slope, you're looking at a much longer fishway, which means more land has to be acquired. You have to build more. There's going to be a higher cost. So you have to come up with a compromise. And it looks like the best compromise is right around this 4 to 5% range, where most of the darters have a decent chance of making it as long as you have resting areas every 6 feet or so. So they may not make it all the way up to the top in one shot, but if they can get up that first 6 feet, rest, essentially catch their breaths, and then take off again, then they can negotiate some of these longer fishways if they have those resting areas. So then the question becomes, what works in the field? And like I said, we have started seeing fishways built on the Front Range, and in most cases, they are not monitored, if at all, after they've been installed. And if we can find the funding, find the personnel to actually monitor these fishways and see what works and what doesn't work, then we can learn some valuable lessons that can be applied to building the next set of fishways. So the lab's been doing a fair bit of this recently. And the way we do this is that we install multiple antennas, and you can see some of these antennas here encased in PVC pipe. These are on the Fossil Creek Irrigation District Fishway on the Poudre River. You connect those antennas to a reader and a data logger, and then you tag hundreds to thousands of fish with little pit tags or RFID tags, just like the ones people put in their pets, release them above and below the fishway, and then just track those tag detections over time to see which fish cross the fishway, which ones start to go into the fishway but don't make it. And then if you combine that with some of the hydrologic data and fish movement data from short-term enclosure studies, you start to build a really good picture of which fishways work, when they work, what conditions they work under, and which fish struggle to get over these fishways, which you can then use when you're designing the next fishway. So to start to wrap up, some of the lessons that we've learned so far are that fish in Front Range rivers, like the Poudre River, move regularly. And given the opportunity, they will actually move substantial distances, even when they're very small fish. They can and will use a well-designed rock ramp fishway to move upstream over or around obstacles, provided they can find the entrance of the fishway and the conditions within the fishway are conducive to successful passage. The fishway at the Fossil Creek Reservoir Irrigation diversion has shown that you can effectively divert water and provide fish passage at the same time, which is key because we do want the irrigation companies to meet their calls for water at the same time, allowing fish to make it upstream. And then in terms of fishway design, it looks like slopes of 4 to 5% with resting areas every 6 to 12 feet or so are ideal. If you can go shallower or with a more gradual slope, that's even better. But 4 to 5% seems to be a decent compromise. And some work that one of my graduate students is wrapping up right now suggests that if you make the texture of the fishway rougher, say a gravel bottom or a cobble bottom, you may see an increase in passage success at a given slope, or you might be able to get away with a slightly steeper slope, but we're still in the early stages of analyzing those data. So next steps for us here at CSU is to complete the ongoing experiments and keep publishing the results of our fishway design studies. We have a big field monitoring study that wraps up this fall. My graduate students are actually on the river as I speak. Again, they do the hard work and I get to sit in front of a computer. If you look at the Poudre River, just between the mouth of the canyon and I-25 in Fort Collins, 3 fishways, 13 structures. I think we can do better. We can try to start restoring more of that connectivity, but it is expensive. So one of the things that we hope to do as a future project is to see whether or not we can come up with a modular fishway, something that you can build at a relatively low cost, retrofit it onto a diversion, again at a low cost, and still allow for good rates of fish passage. And finally, I would say we can't forget about some of the smaller tributaries. You know, things like Spring Creek also have fish passage issues, but you do have to think about what invasive species might be able to do if they do get passage there. And in the case of Spring Creek, we have western mosquito fish here in the main stem Poudre River, but they're not in Spring Creek. Spring Creek has the native plains top minnow, and if the mosquito fish get into top minnow habitat, there is a chance they could outcompete them. So there are times where we may not want to put in a fishway, and that's where you would talk to Colorado Parks and Wildlife to get some guidance on when or where fishways might not be the best idea. So with that, I will hand things over to Tracy, and then if you have questions, please do put them in the chat box, and I'll be glad to try to answer those later. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Myrick. Sorry, I'm trying to figure this whole system out. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Well, thank you, Hallie, for inviting me to speak, and I'm glad to see folks on the video call. This is I'm glad that we're able to do this in light of the current circumstance. I'm excited to talk to you about a project that's currently in construction on the middle South Platte River. It's the Godfrey Ditch Diversion relocation project, and I'm going to focus on the resiliency and the fish passage portions of the project. This has been a super interesting project as it's gone. We've been involved, the project team, as shown on the slide, have been involved since 2018, and it's gone through the ringer for sure in terms of constraints and setbacks. And I'm fairly certain that most folks were not quite sure if it was going to make it to construction, but here we are, and we are in the middle of construction and hopefully completing the project by the end of the year. So as I mentioned, it's on the middle South Platte River. Down here at the bottom of the page, the red pin is showing the project location. So it's located just upstream of the Big Thompson River. And then as you can see, the Poudre River up here on the north, and the confluence with the South Platte and the Poudre is out east of Greeley. So zooming into the project location, so flow in this image is going up the page to the north, and the previous Godfrey diversion is located right here in this green circle. So this system, the South Platte, specifically the middle South Platte, is highly responsive, right? It's a fine-grained system. Sand and gravel mainly make up the bed. So it likes to adjust, and when it adjusts, it likes to adjust laterally, vertically, when it has changes in flow or changes in sediment coming from upstream. So the issues that we're talking about today are these diversion structures. So when you start throwing in these cross-channel structures or even armored banks, you stop the ability for the river to adjust how it needs to adjust to changing conditions. So that just pushes the problem upstream or downstream. So specifically for Godfrey, not only is it a fish barrier, it's a 9-foot tall fish barrier, it's also a barrier to sediment as well as flow in most of the year. So Dan will be talking more about some of the maintenance issues associated with the structure. I'm going to talk mostly about the river processes and kind of the resiliency and the design of the project. So talking specifically about the project, it's funded through DOLA's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Watershed Resilience Pilot Program. Whew, mouthful. But essentially this program is to increase the resiliency of the diversion system, the river system, all while delivering the full degree of water to the ditch. So in this case for Godfrey, we're talking 57 CFS. And the specific goals on the left, I think we're mainly going to talk about the first one, enabling that fish passage, as well as safe recreational boater passage. That was also included as a goal for the project. Also talking about enhancing aquatic and riparian habitats, reduce the maintenance requirements for the ditch. Dan will go into that, but there's lots of sediment in the system, and that's been a major issue for the ditch. Hitting the resiliency piece, limiting damage potential in future floods, designing the project such that the structure and the river reach can be resilient, can bounce back quicker after the next big flood instead of just completely falling apart. That's one of the major goals, and in doing that, it's reducing the sediment transport disruption, so allowing some sediment to move through the system. So we'll get into how we attack some of that in this project. And also increasing water efficiency for the ditch itself. So this project went through quite an extensive alternatives analysis. What's going to be the best solution to solve all the problems that we're having at Godfrey is just to eliminate the diversion altogether, right? That's the best solution. And we looked into that. The first option is to potentially remove the diversion and combine points of diversion with an upstream existing structure. So we went down that path and got actually pretty far along that path. Not far, but at least further than previous efforts. So we had several talks with the ditch board for the upstream diversion, and it all came down to timeline. The timeline of this funding source was so short that it just didn't allow for the amount of time that it would take to get through the legal documentation for both ditch companies to come to the table and feel comfortable in the, what do they call it, forced marriage of combining these points of diversion. It would take years of legal work to get that documentation in place, and we just didn't have that time. So unfortunately, that alternative was tabled. The next alternative that we evaluated was a solar-powered pump station, which again would eliminate the need for a cross-channel diversion, but this alternative just proved to be, I think, too costly in terms of maintenance and replacement costs for these pumps. And I think it's because the amount of water that needs to be pumped is large enough that it would require numerous pumps. I think this could be a viable option for a lower water decrease, so in the 10 to 20 CFS potentially. So unfortunately, that alternative was taken off the table as well. So we ended up with moving the structure further upstream to a more stable cross-section for one, and then incorporating this bladder dam diversion option. And this structure, and if you're not familiar with the bladder dam, it's essentially gates that are held up with, say, an airbag, right? So you fill the airbag, the gates are pushed up and closed. You let the air out, the gates will drop, which would allow water and sediment to move through the channel. You raise those back up, and then it pushes the flow into the ditch. So this is a big component of this project, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. So just talking briefly about the design process. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty here. I just wanted to make it clear kind of how this design process might happen. We're looking at all of the existing conditions. What's the flow like out there? How has it changed? What's the geomorphic character of the site? How has that changed over time, and how do we expect it to change in the future? What are some of the ecological components of the site? You start also looking at the sediment, the topography. A lot of that is fed into the design process, and specifically looking at hydraulic modeling. This particular project, we looked at 1D and 2D modeling to evaluate the design, and as well as for permitting. I'm not going to go into the permitting, that's a whole separate topic, but we did use 1D and 2D for a lot of the floodplain development permit. So coming into the actual design process, what I think this image illustrates is just the cyclical nature of how this works. You start getting into the design, and then you have to double check that, make sure that the flows work, the permitting aspects of the floodplain development, like you're not increasing water surface elevation, or the big piece for this one is how tall do we have to make the structure to make sure that there's flow getting to the ditch, but we don't want to make it overly tall, because we're also looking at the river resiliency component. So we definitely iterated on a lot of these aspects. And then overarching all of this is the available budget for the construction. We were dealing with federal funding, so we're talking a very specific budget. And we definitely iterated on that quite a bit to make sure that what we were designing was fitting within the construction budget. So looking specifically at a couple of design criteria that were used for fish passage, and thankfully we are within the realm, I think, that Dr. Myrick already talked about. We were pushing for a 2% slope on the steepest portion of the channel design, which is the riffles in this case. And then less than 2 feet per second velocity, half a foot to a foot depth in the riffles during the low flow time. And then the diversion criteria, we're looking at to divert at least 70 CFS. The water rate decree is 57 CFS, but we were pushing that up a bit just to account for water loss through the ditch system, which is quite extensive. If you can see on this image on the left, where the green little side channel, this is their ditch system before it comes into their measurement structure. The other component of the diversion criteria was also to look at how wide can we get a diversion bladder portion to be able to enable sediment to move through this cross-section. So let's just jump right into what we designed. So something that should be noted, Naranjo Civil Constructors is the prime and the contractors for this project, and they fly a drone every week, which has been so helpful. The drone imagery and the videos help monitor the progress of the site, but it also provides such a valuable tool for many purposes. But right here, this is an image of pre-project, so no earth has moved at this point. It's just illustrating what it looked like before. So right here is the existing Godfrey diversion. And our design, and this is what's kind of in all these various colors, includes a fish passage rock ramp on the left portion of the channel over here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. A 3-foot tall bladder dam, which is on the right side of the channel over here. And then all the red and the yellow, these are hardened riffle structures. Now, I can completely acknowledge that riffles are not naturally found in the Middle South Platte. Well, it may be bedrock controlled, but this is really not particularly what we would want to see in the site, but for what we're given in this scenario with a 9-foot drop, we don't have a lot of room to move the diversion upstream. This is the best scenario to get fish passage, to provide some stability to the channel, as well as get the water to the ditch company. So I think with what we're given, I think this is the best option to work with. So we have the 4 riffles here, and then we're filling the old ditch on this upstream portion of it, and we're providing a new portion of the ditch through the riparian area here. Another piece that's, I think, important to note is that we're also able to remove this berm. There's a berm that's separating the river from this old ag land on the right of the screen. So I think that's going to be really beneficial for the system, opening up and connecting that floodplain. So I'm now overtopping an image that this is just taken a couple days ago from the drone flight earlier this week. So as I mentioned, we're in process for construction, obviously. All of the river work has been completed. And the diversion, the bladder dam, which you can see right in here, this is in process. They are starting to pour the concrete or forming for the pour next week. So in this image, you can see, and I'm gonna go through a video flight as well. So I'll get more detailed into this, but just a general overview, fish passage ramp coming down this way. You can see most of the low flow is consolidated in this path, which is great to see. The riffles, you can just barely make them out in this image. We'll get a little closer, you can see them. We filled the ditch here, and here's this new portion of ditch coming through here. And then we remove the berm. So I'm gonna jump out real quick, hopefully this works. I wanna show you some of the video drone footage from Naranjo, which is fantastic. Super thankful that they have this technology to work with. I'm gonna pause it real quick to show now similar, but now at least it's a little bit angled so you can see this fish passage ramp. This portion right here is a rock weir, and it's just trying to make up the width between the narrow rock fish passage ramp and the Obermeyer structure. So this has all just been dewatered so that they can start pouring concrete to make the pad for the bladder dam that will be installed later this summer into the fall. And the rock ramp is mainly for boater passage during higher flows. And you can see the low flow pathway moving through. So I'll let this fly a little bit. Now we're coming from the downstream, moving upstream. You can see this most downstream riffle coming across right here. I'm gonna pause it again and just talk quickly about what you're looking at over here. This is a little side channel. This portion of the channel was flanked. It flanked the original structure, which was upstream of this little island. And we left this because it's, I think, a great off-channel habitat. We graded the banks back and we put in some woody material and some native vegetation. This is 2 more riffles right in here. You can see that larger rock, and larger by, meaning 6 to 12-inch rock was made up the riffles. Here's where we filled the ditch, the old ditch, and we've added some root wads, some woody material, and some revegetation. And all this area will be revegetated come fall. So hopefully by this time next year, this will be quite the green corridor. So I'll let it fly upstream. Here's the second riffle, the first riffle, and you can see the fish passage ramp coming down over here. And then this is just the dewatered area for the concrete work. Okay, so I'm going to come back to my presentation and just show you some photos from the ground, which it's always nice to get different perspectives. This is looking at the crest of the fish passage structure. So we're looking towards the left bank. So flow is moving from the left to the right. And you can see that we've placed several, actually throughout all the riffles and the fish passage, we put many habitat boulders for resting places, lots of large wood material, small wood material, medium, all of it for resting places, cover, just complexity. And you can see that this is notched down to where flow goes into the ditch behind us, behind this photo. And as soon as the ditch gets as much up to the 70 CFS, it starts overtopping this low flow notch, is the intent. This is looking downstream of the fish passage channel. Again, lots of woody material and habitat boulders. This is still looking downstream, but now we're looking across the channel. And you can tell that this is all dry right now because it's low flow right now in the South Platte, and all the flow is being pushed either into the ditch or down the fish passage channel. This is just a close-up looking at this complexity in here and how the habitat boulders are able to slow that water, create little pools, eddies for the fish to rest before they start pushing up to the next little resting area. Again, just looking downstream on the fish passage ramp. Looking upstream at this point on the fish passage ramp where the structure, the diversion structure will be over here. And now this is one of the riffles downstream. So the structure is up here at the top of the page. And this is just one of the riffles showing the various elevations of the habitat boulders, the various substrate size, hoping to roughen up that channel to allow for areas for the fish to push on up. And then just the channel structure, right, to keep the channel stable in these higher slopes than what is typically found in the South Platte. So that's all I have. I'm just gonna stop sharing and hand it over to Dan to talk about it from the ditch company's perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tracy. And first and foremost, thanks to everybody for taking the time to tune in to what is a very important subject matter. So my name is Dan Gallen. I'm the treasurer for the Godfrey Ditch, and I was asked to speak on behalf of not just the Godfrey, but kind of a general ag perspective as it relates to this subject matter. So I figured a quick background in regards to the Godfrey and its history. The Godfrey was incorporated in March of 1870, so it's been around for some time. Its original appropriation dates are 26 CFS in 1870 and an additional 30 CFS in 1873, so that 57 CFS Tracy had mentioned has been a calling right on the South Platte for well over 100 years. And in certain hydrologic years, it does have the ability to sweep the river, which obviously plays into fish passage. Relatively speaking, it's a smaller system. It irrigates a little over 2,000 acres, and its original decreed purpose was for agriculture, milling, as well as dairy purposes. And it is located, as Tracy mentioned, just west of the town of LaSalle and just south of the town of Greeley, close to the confluence of both the Cache-la-Poudre and St. Vrain. And Haley, if you wouldn't mind just kind of skipping to our next slide, it's a general overview of the system itself. That blue dot is the river diversion Tracy was just mentioning, and the transparent green parcels are irrigated land. And last but not least, I've got two images we'll end on for the rest of my little slideshow presentation, but it's just to show some of the operational challenges the company has dealt with prior to the current river diversion. As Tracy mentioned, this is a very braided and sandy stretch of the river, and so while there was a point in time that we actually had concrete rebar and a proper structure in the river for our diversion. Over time, things like the 2013 flood and subsequent high flow events have eroded that infrastructure such that in today's world, we really are reliant upon almost a sand dam. After a major rain event in the metro area, you'll get a big slug flow that washes down river. And that's what you see on this right-hand picture here, just that we push sand up against that old foundation of the structure, and in your high flow events, the river will notch that sand somewhere and start blowing through that diversion, at which point we get back in the river and push it back up to keep irrigation running. From a ditch company perspective, specifically related to fish passage, if I'm being perfectly transparent, the farming community has a ton of liability and just third-party factors to deal with inherently as part of the industry. So from the company's perspective, really our focal point is always getting water to our shareholders. The ag community has significant upfront costs between seed, fertilizer, and prep for that season, as well as within the season, you have your hydrologic conditions, and if you get a reduced share delivery for your water, higher temperatures can reduce your crop yields. You have different market pricing, and all that to say that on any given day, fish generally are not on the radar for your average farmer because they've got so many other end needs that demand their attention. It's all they can do to keep their crops growing and get them to market. Not even addressing the fact that you have significant upfront costs until you realize your revenue from your sale of crops. So fish, honestly, on a daily basis, it's really not something that we're constantly thinking about and concerned about. That river diversion has been there for well over 100 years. And if you talk to some of the third, fourth generation farmers in the local community, during high flow events, after things got washed out, the next day they were standing in the river chest deep with hay bales, just plugging those holes to try to keep water on the crops. So that's definitely always the focal point, is keeping water on your crops. Fast forward to today's day and age, and there are a number of end users with different competing end needs for that same limited supply or water. And so fish passage really represents an opportunity, not just for the Godfrey shareholders, but any ditch company shareholder to partnership with a multitude of different groups for what is a win-win. From our perspective, we need the diversion structure itself to keep water flowing. And there's a significant cost component to keeping that infrastructure viable and operational. And oftentimes the cost for this structure can exceed just the financial wherewithal of your shareholder base. And that was the case for the Godfrey. We would have continued status quo until we had to go to the CWCB for a special assessment, essentially, to pay to maintain the flow of water. And that is not a new diversion, that's a patch. So fish essentially represent an opportunity for us to get third-party funding and assistance to include engineering and construction and permitting to keep what is the primary water on the crops flowing. With that, just some general high-level stuff for anybody in the audience who might be looking to engage with the agricultural community for any number of reasons. Essentially in the ag community, come spring and summer, that's when you're either planting or actively working and harvesting your crops. So the ag time is not available to actually hold these conversations. Whereas in the fall and winter, that's after you've harvested and sold, the ag community tends to have a little more time available to engage in these discussions. And that's also relevant for one of Tracy's comments. This has been ongoing for years. And so just a ditch board's availability to put the time in to go through these iterative processes to realize a new structure can also be a limiting factor, as their attention is needed spring and summer for the actual ag component of their industry. Beyond that, I was going to try to wrap up a little early to facilitate some questions. Happy to dive into any one subject matter to a greater extent.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free to enter in, type in any questions that you might have for any of our panelists in the chat feature. One question that is in there right now is, are there any citizen science projects ongoing to help monitor the pooter? You mentioned that they are monitored well after they aren't monitored well after the diversions have been put in. Is there any way that locals can help with this? To my knowledge, there is not any like citizen science monitoring specifically for diversion structures, but CPRW does have a citizen science water quality monitoring program. Dr. Myrick or Tracy, I'm not sure if you guys, if anyone else is aware of any monitoring citizen science.
So this is Dr. Myrick or Chris, because I find being called doctor just kind of funny. To my knowledge, there are not any citizen monitoring projects going on related specifically to fish passage. And that's probably just because of the infrastructure that's required. And whereas you can stand by one of these fish passage structures and watch it for, and I'll stand there and watch it for an hour just to see if you can see fish going by. A lot of times the water conditions are such that you can't see anything. So you do typically need some sort of remote antenna or monitoring system like that set up. Now, that being said, I know there is talk of trying to set up a remote monitoring system that would tie into some of the Denver community down on the South Platte by the new, or the new construction that's going in at the National Western Center down there, right there in the heart of Denver, where they are hoping to put in some fish passage structures there to address some of the issues they have with the South Platte. And that will at least give citizens a chance to see how these systems work and, you know, to a minor degree participate in some of the science or some of the monitoring. But just because of the nature of the work, at least so far, I don't think anyone's come up with a good way to do it. But it is something that would be worth visiting with, say, Colorado Parks and Wildlife over, because if they can potentially provide some of the infrastructure, perhaps citizen groups could do some of the labor or the personnel time to actually go out, make sure the antennas are still intact, download the data, something along those lines. But as far as I know, nothing is currently set up in that manner.
Thanks, Chris. So here's another question. I'll just throw it out to the group and whoever is best appropriate. It might be Chris or Tracy. Is there any data about how well fish passage structures survive flooding events, or is that determined when we have floods on these rivers?
Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I think from the Godfrey project specific and several other projects that we're currently either designing or constructing, you know, the way that we're sizing the material for the fish passage rock ramp, we're sizing them such that they're should be stable in a 100-year event, at least for this particular project. So at least that's what we're designing it for, and so hopefully it would survive flood events. But I don't know about what has, you know, any of the existing projects or existing passage structure.
I think the majority of the structures that we've studied are actually ones that have gone in after the 2013 floods. That was, you know, when a lot of the structures were damaged, that gave the irrigation companies and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, an opportunity to partner to retrofit the structures with fish passageways. So we don't necessarily know how they'll do in another one of those epic flood events. We do know that some of the designs that have been adapted coming from other countries have actually gone through some pretty significant floods, and they seem to have done well. But I think it is going to vary on almost a site-by-site basis, depending on just how those structures are designed. And you would have to talk to the engineers who did most of the actual design work. But I think they are planning, or their planning is such that the structures should be able to withstand that 100-year or even, you know, a 200 or 500-year event, because they know that sometime in the future they are going to be faced with another one of those events.
Okay, we have a few other questions. This one is specifically for the ditch company's perspective. So from the ditch company's perspective, have or do you think perceptions are changing by shareholders around components like fish passage, sediment transport, etc.? In other words, experiencing 100+ years of a dynamic river system at the South Platte, have shareholders embraced this new model, or is it more of a means to an end to continue to deliver water without having to bear the full cost by the ditch company?
So the clear answer to that is both yes and no, and it depends on your shareholder. I apologize for the ambiguous response, but in a nutshell, you have larger farming operations who have diversified portfolios, and the owner of the share or land is not needed from a labor perspective to actually be physically hands-on in the field. And in those circumstances, there is far more just education in terms of the multi-benefits and not just having an ag lens on it, whereas your smaller operations really take up 100% of that individual's time to strictly keep that farm going. And so there's a bit of a subset there to begin with. Additionally, when it comes to engaging the agricultural community, you don't get a holistic voice from the ag perspective, because whether it's a public meeting or a forum such as this, you don't always get the entire ag community to turn out and engage in conversation at the table. And that can be for a number of reasons. They could be a 5th-generation farmer, and if you don't go crops, they don't want to talk to you. It could be because they're so busy they don't have the time. So it's really hard to get a one-size-fits-all response to that. I'll say confidently, the needs along the South Platte River and the entirety of the Front Range have grown significantly in the past 100 years. If you went back to 1950 and you went to LaSalle, Greeley, all these smaller towns, 90% of the populace was in the ag community, and they all had a common need and common understanding. In today's world, you're getting a development that used to be ag land built up against a ditch system, and now you have competing needs whereby you still have shareholders who really have the ag perspective, but then you have a rec component or an environmental component for riparian health, because that is of value and interest to that local community who is built. Additionally, you have your municipal suppliers, your Greeleys, your LaSalles, that are really looking to create a well-rounded model to facilitate that growth within their district, but meet all those end needs. And the fact of the matter is, there's really not enough physical water in the system to fill everybody to the extent they'd like to see. So it truly is a balance, and you need to have that understanding, and that is present within the ag community. If you attend your annual meeting of shareholders, they understand that growing need, but they also want to protect what is their property right and livelihood.
Thanks, Dan. So we have another question. It looks like Chris responded to one of the other questions that was in the chat box, so you guys can access that. But the other question is, are there other aspects of river habitat that are critical for these small-bodied native fish, i.e. backwater channels for reproduction or temperature refuges? In other words, are there river design upstream or downstream from the fish passage that we should include to ensure greater population success overall?
I guess the simple answer to that question is yes. It all matters, because if you look at a typical river in an urban area, we tend to try to constrain the river so it doesn't go out and start destroying people's property. We often try to keep it within a channel, and for good reason. As someone who's lived along rivers, lived along streams, you don't really want the river chewing away the foundations of your house. But at the same time, when the river can spread out into a more natural floodplain, that does provide habitat for fish and other aquatic organisms, as well as connect with the riparian areas. So in a perfect world, you would have lots of opportunities to have backwater channels and off-channel habitat where some of these fish could go for reproduction, because some will use that habitat, others do not, or areas where they can go and get out of high temperature or low temperature events. But it really, at least in my mind, has to tie into the area that you're working in. So if you're out on the Poudre River and you're out near Greeley, or you're on the South Platte and you're headed out towards Sterling, where you actually have a very wide floodplain, it's pretty easy to do that. If you're looking at the Poudre River as it runs through Fort Collins, or you're looking at the St. Vrain River as it runs through Longmont, there are more limited opportunities to have this wider river corridor without starting to impact some of the private property or municipal property. So it becomes a bit of a, I guess you could say, a negotiation, or a question of what matters more for that particular location. And you have to, even as a fish biologist, I understand there are places where you just will not be able to do that. But ideally, you would have some areas where you have some of those backwater habitats, off-channel habitats that the fish can access. You just have to be realistic and realize that you can't have that everywhere. Because you can't, say, go tearing into the back of a building or the back of someone's house just because that's where you would like to have the fish go. But the idea of sort of reconnecting these stretches of river would help that some of the fish that may not be able to find that habitat right in that immediate area could migrate upstream or downstream and then find that habitat that they want, rather than being constrained to a really short segment of river.
And I'll build on that point. I think it's important to keep in mind the practicality of operating a system in today's world. And what I mean by that is you have different temperatures of water coming out of an effluent treatment plant as you would having your alluvial return flows seep through the ground as you would snow melt. The fact of the matter is the ebb and flow in the river in today's world is heavily influenced by infrastructure, be it reservoir releases or return flows from agriculture, versus prior to the West being settled, your snow melt and floods in the spring followed by dry up in the summertime. And so it's a balance between what we can do today to help facilitate the recovery of these species, coupled with the need to operate a system to meet demand.
So here is a question I think kind of for CPRW, but one thing here is that CPRW we kind of took over the project after a lot of the initial design and all the conversations with the ditch board and everything had already happened. So the question is, can you share any lessons from initial conversations between the watershed group and the ditch board that led to successful implementation of this project? So I don't know if Tracy and Dan, if you guys want to chime in here.
Yeah, I can at least start, and Dan can give his perspective. I think from my perspective, and not just on Godfrey, but several other projects, I think the key component was bringing folks affiliated with the ditch company to the table as soon as possible in the process of the project, to make sure that we're getting all of their ideas and concerns on the table and making sure that they're heard for one, but then also they have way more information of what the river has done in the previous decades than we'll ever have, I think, because they've been watching it for generations. So I think acknowledging that is huge, and getting them to the table early, I think, is the other kicker. But what Dan already mentioned is that that's hard. You know, they don't want to take time out of their day when they're actively out there working the field. So I think it's a matter of timing it appropriately and making sure that we can work with their schedules and listening.
I'd agree with all of that, and I would add to it, establishing very clear expectations for different roles and responsibilities throughout the project itself. There were several things that the Godfrey had to do to facilitate this project, and we couldn't have done it by ourselves. That being said, it's important up front to know if certain components of the project are funded through DOLA or if they need to be funded through shareholder assessments, and if that means a special assessment. There are implications for any project to this effect as it relates to the water decrees themselves and potential for injury for your local water users, be it other ditch systems or farmers, and the just repercussions within the LaSalle area to that effect. At the end of the day, these are your neighbors, and even if there is no injury, but there's a perceived injury, that influences relationships that have been long standing. So understanding all of those different undercurrents before progress is really made on the project, it goes a long way to get buy-in from the local community as well.
Thanks, Dan and Tracy. I think we have time for one last quick question. This is for Chris. Is there an existing diversion structure on the Poudre or South Platte that would be highly impactful to redesign with fish passage?
I think for that question, I would have to defer to my colleagues and collaborators with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, because I know they've looked very carefully at the systems to try to identify the ones that will have the most impact for, I guess you could say, to use a cliche, the most bang for your buck. You know, if there is a structure that, by retrofitting it with fish passage, opens up miles and miles of habitat, that would be probably a higher priority structure than one that opens up a couple hundred yards of habitat before you encounter the next barrier or the next obstacle. But since I'm not entirely familiar with the entire South Platte system, I can't identify any one structure. I know the city of Fort Collins is looking to retrofit one of the diversions actually right by the natural areas office with a fish passage structure. But as you saw in that presentation, there are a series of other structures going up towards the canyon. There are a couple in the canyon, but it would really be a question for Colorado Parks and Wildlife to be able to say this is the one that we think would have the most impact based on how much habitat it would open up, and then also based on the information that they collect each year on the fish community and fish populations within the river, and which ones would actually be the most impactful. So great question. I would say do them all, but we don't have that much money.
I'd add on to that. An easy starting point is looking at the call regime and seeing who consistently sweeps the river in terms of existing structures, because anytime you're sweeping the river, you have a dry up point below that, which is inherently a barrier. That said, even if you did retrofit all the calling rights with fish passages, it's a domino effect. If they're no longer sweeping the river, there's always a more junior right waiting in line to put that call on the river. And so it really is economically driven as well in terms of bang for your buck. You can't simply say, here's a dry up, let's go there. It's can we retrofit this and open up how many linear miles versus 100 yards?
Thanks to all of our panelists. I think Laura is going to close us out.
I am. Yeah, thank you guys. That was very informative. So the Poudre River Fest is organized by a committee of nonprofits in the Fort Collins community, including Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. So just wanted to let everybody know who is the team behind the festival. Proceeds from the Poudre River Fest go to support restoration projects on the Poudre River. If anybody on the call or anybody listening on Facebook is willing and able to donate, we would love to have you join us at poudreriverfest.org to make your donation today. And then also for this year's virtual Poudre River Fest, we are doing an online auction where we are auctioning a 2015 Felt Cruiser bike donated by New Belgium Brewery. This is a brand new bike, still in the box. You might have to pull out your wrench to put it together, but it is a great opportunity to support the Poudre River while also getting something back for yourself. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our Lunch and Learn session. We still have more programming coming up over the next couple of days. So please visit poudreriverfest.org to see the additional programming we have going on. But thank you very much for coming today.